with that. Now, on to introductions here. We'll first start with Mimi Carr. She was born in Gainesville and grew up by Weewa Pond near Micanopy. After graduating from the University of Florida, she went to work in Washington, D.C., first for a U.S. congressman and then at the Smithsonian Institutions. In 1970, she went back to school and entered the actor training program at Wayne State University in Detroit. She interned at the Alley Theater in Houston, and for the next 25 years was a member of the acting companies of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, the Seattle's Intiman Theater, the American Conservancy Theater in San Francisco, the Playmaker Rep in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and the Alabama Shakespeare Festival. She returned to Gainesville in the mid-1990s to assist her mother, and while living in Gainesville, she created and directed a theater piece derived from several short stories by Marjorie Canaan Rawlings. You all know her as the author of The Yearling and others, along with a cooking demonstration, which I suspect came from Cross Creek Cookery, a wonderful cookbook. The piece was performed in Gainesville in 1996 as part of the 100th anniversary celebration of Rawlings' birth. She continues to perform selections from this piece, and hopefully we will get her here. She also created a two-persons reader theater piece made up of letters between Marjorie Canaan Rawlings and her editor from Scribner's, Maxwell Perkins. She retired from the Alachua County Sheriff's Department in 2018. Now we go to Archie Carr III, known to his family as Chuck because his father was known as Archie. He was born in Gainesville at the end of World War II and was soon whisked off with his sister Mimi to the Honduras for about 5 years. In 1952, the family moved to a farm in Micanopy, surrounded by nature, a move that helped shape Chuck's career. Chuck graduated from Gainesville High, received his undergrad degree at FSU in International Affairs with a specialty in Latin America. He earned his master's in wildlife ecology at UF, served 2 years at sea in the U.S. Navy, then on to Michigan to earn his Ph.D. focusing on the ecology of tropical estuaries. His fieldwork was in Costa Rica, working at the same facility that was established years ago by his father as a base for his well-known sea turtle research. His career experiences include Florida Audubon Society, the New York Zoological Society, now the Wildlife Conservation Society, as assistant director for international programs in New York, and later as regional coordinator for Central America and the Caribbean with its headquarters in Gainesville, where he remained until his retirement a few years ago. Dr. Carr is particularly pleased with his contributions to the conservation of the huge Belize Barrier Reef and for visualizing and directing the Paseo Pantera project, an effort to link all the parks from Panama to southern Mexico with biological corridors. Chuck was probably most intimately exposed to his mother's burgeoning struggle with the Cross Florida Barge Canal during his school years at Gainesville High. Updates on progress and setbacks with the challenge were practically daily dinner time occurrences. One more to go here. Dr. Peggy McDonald. She will moderate this panel today. Peggy is a native Floridian and the executive director of the Matheson History Museum in Gainesville. She has taught history at Stetson University, Florida Polytechnic University, Indian River State College, and the University of Florida. Her book, Marjorie Harris Carr, Defender of Florida's Environment, won honorable mention in Forward Review's 2014 IndieFab Book of the Year Award contest in Women's Studies. She writes articles on local history for the Gainesville Magazine, Our Town Magazine, Senior Times Magazine, and Examiner.com. She is an alumna of the University of Florida with a Ph.D. in history in 2010 and an undergrad at Hollins University, a women's college in Roanoke, Virginia. Dr. McDonald is on a return engagement to Oak Hammock, having delighted us with previous presentations, and is responsible for bringing together this panel. Please give them all a big hand.
Pat Harden's back. It's the most fascinating back. Pat, could you turn around so the audience could see your sweater? Lovely, isn't it, to stare at for the past few minutes? And I'd also like to thank Deborah Hendricks with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program for recording this. It's very rare to get Archie Carr III and Marjorie Mimi Carr together to talk about their parents' legacy and growing up with these unusual parents. And also we have student filmmakers from University of North Florida. So this is a prominent panel.
And his name is Sean Harris, and I apologize for not introducing them before.
And we like the name Harris because it was Marjorie's maiden name. Now, Mimi, I'd like to start with you in keeping with the theme of the Ocklawaha. If you could take us back to before the activism, before the Cross-Florida Barge Canal, your mother first fell in love with the Ocklawaha River in 1936, working as the nation's first female federal wildlife technician. Could you talk about any memories you have of your mother talking about that early Ocklawaha?
Yes. If I could just preface, it was her first job after graduating from college. And I remember her talking about going down the river and fishing, and the giant bass that were living in the Ocklawaha River. I also remember her when mother and father, daddy, discovered, or at least in my memory, discovered the William Bartram, the travels of William Bartram, and were reading it, and were just ululaing over how incredible his writing was about the places that we all knew, like Paynes Prairie and like the Ocklawaha River. And she didn't talk about it all that much, but it was something that was part of her. And I think a lot of it had to do with being at that fish hatchery in 1936 and living in Palatka. She lived in a boarding house in Palatka, and they had the fish hatchery, and they also were raising quail. I think it was part of a WPA project or something like that. And mother was thankful to have a job, but also thankful to be in such a beautiful place. You know, she came from South Florida. She came from a rather lovely place down near Fort Myers and in Fort Myers. So it was the connection with the river and bass was very much a part of her early life. She did her master's research on the larval development of the largemouth black bass. So it was just part of her. She didn't talk about it all the time, but it was just part of her growing as a woman and as a scientist.
Thank you, Mimi. Interesting that you bring up the abundant bass in the Ocklawaha River before the dam. Now, Chuck, do you know if your microphone is warming up, or do we want to pass the hot potato? Awesome. To add to that, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your father. Specifically, you've followed in your father's past the most of the 5 Carr children. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the science growing up, both for your father and Uncle Tom, and in the Carr family with the 5 of you, the importance of science.
Well, that's a good question, good point. To be close to those 2 Ph.D.s from earliest childhood. My uncle, by the way, grew up to take over the physics department here at the University of Florida. He was an astrophysicist and studied radio signals coming out of Jupiter. And that's about all I know about it. It's really sophisticated work that he did. And as to Daddy, there's a couple of steps there. One of them out there on the farm, we grew to, my brothers and I and my sister, to appreciate nature. I mean, we were encouraged to, hey, that's a pretty snake. Yeah. And birds and whatnot. So that was one thing. It was a very positive thing. And both parents encouraged us to, yeah, that's not something to shy away from. Oh, thank you. And so we actually, my brothers and I collected snakes. We had them in cages and whatnot. So that was one thing. But the more profound thing is, but you have to get a little more mature to pick up on some of the science behind the sea turtle questions. And I started going to Tortuguero when I was in high school. So I was quite young, and he had graduate students down there and whatnot. And slowly you got to comprehend what were the scientific objectives of this hardy work down there on the Turtle Beach. And it's called tag and recapture, a lot of it, where you put a little numbered tag on the turtle's flipper. She nests. These are nesting turtles on this beach. Once she's done nesting, she vanishes. And in all likelihood, she's captured by a Nicaraguan fisherman. And that fisherman takes the tag off and it says, please return to the University of Florida for a reward. Well, that's data. And you get enough of these tags, you can pretty soon map the migratory pattern of the sea turtles. And frankly, that's what that question about where do the turtles go was the most nagging thing that drove my father into sea turtle research to begin with, because you could find sea turtles. You can go out to Cedar Key now, and you can see adults and young turtles swimming around, but where'd they come from? Well, you'd have to do a sort of tag and recapture to answer that question. And after he was like 52, they wrote the Handbook of Turtles, a big taxonomy text. And in that book, the Handbook of Turtles of North America, he singled out or identified these huge questions in the marine turtle biology. And so he didn't write any more taxonomy books. He wrote The Windward Road and got deeply into sea turtle ecology and biology. So to get back to your question, I gradually caught up with some of those questions that Daddy and the students were trying to answer and how they were going about it over time.
I'd just like to add, Peggy, that one of the things that I remember about both Mother and Daddy was that there was nothing really pretentious about their scientific background. They just loved nature. They really did. I think in some ways Mother was more of a naturalist than Daddy. She was an only child. She grew up in Bonita Springs when her parents went there in 1920. And it was, there weren't many kids to play with. Her main connection, as Peggy has pointed out, was she had a cracker pony. They didn't call them then, but they were the little horses that lived on Kissimmee Prairie that are direct descendants from the horses the Spanish brought over. They say they're even more pure blood than the Mustang. That, these horses got out on the Kissimmee and interbred and didn't breed with other, ranches like the Mustangs did. So these cracker horses are straight back to the little cob, I think they called them, the little short-legged, muscular Spanish riding horse that was brought by the conquistadores. They came. But Mother just, I don't know, nature was just part, and Daddy too. It was just part of their fabric. They just loved it. And there was some funny things that I remember, and I hope you won't think ill of my mother and ill of me to tell this little story, but it was coming time for me to start to become a woman, if you understand what I mean by that. And my brothers had been down at the pond collecting frogs that were mating, and they brought a bucket of frogs with all these eggs and the two frogs together doing their thing. And, in retrospect, I think, Mother, oh, Mimi's getting up that age. I think I need to tell her about menstruation. And, I remember it was amusing. I was sophisticated enough to be slightly amused by it, but also like, oh, Mother, is that what it looks like? God, and that was so Mother, I'll never forget that. But, you know, the frogs, it was illustrative material of some interest. And she was just like that. She was very good. I remember when somebody brought a little pet screech owl that had fallen out of a nest, and it was breakfast time. And that screech owl was probably absolutely terrified. And the first place it went was under Mother's skirts. We were eating breakfast, and she had on her bathrobe. She loved nature. It was just part of her fabric, as much as it was Daddy, but it really was part of the fabric of her life.
Well, that's a fantastic story, which leads naturally into another story that I think it's appropriate to tell today, which was when you're in the same age, junior high school, and you grew up in part in rural Micanopy on a 200-plus acre homestead, and that involved raising, was this a steer that was being taken to market? You need to tell the story.
This is with a father's story, and I think probably all of you have had experiences. Thank you, Chuck, for letting me go along. But we had this sort of half-assed farm out there, which consisted of 1 bull and 6 cows. And of those, 2 were milk cows, which Chuck and I started milking when Chuck was 5 and I was 7. And one early memory I have of my brother Chuck is early in the morning, he'd go off to find the cows while I was fixing what we called the tit washing apparatus, which was, God, all these little home memories. You're all going to think we're idiots. But it was the thing to wash the udder with, and preparing the buckets for the milk, and preparing the strainer. We strained the milk and then we pasteurized it. But seeing in the early morning Chuck, and it must have been in the summertime, riding one of the cows as the 2 of them came up. I mean, it looked like something out of India, this little skinny boy on this skinny cow riding out of the mist, the milk cow. But anyhow, I've lost the train of thought. What was it?
Going to junior high.
Okay, but we also would try to do a steer, which I think I'll leave that part out, which was another moment with father and his 4 children having to fix up this steer. I'll move on. It will make the men uncomfortable. God, it was, do you remember that, Chuck? Oh my God. Hold on to it, hold on to that, hold on. And the poor steer went, oh. It wasn't cutting, it was clipping. Oh God. Chuck would hold the front legs, I would hold one leg, and my 2 other brothers would hold the other leg, and I was like, and my little brothers were flapping in the wind, and Daddy, hold on, you know. But anyhow, the steer would go to market, and we had this yellow Dodge truck, and Daddy would put the truck, he put railings up, and the steer would go in, and then Daddy would pack his 4 children in the cab of the truck to take us to school from Micanopy into Gainesville. And of course, I knew there were 2 of them this time, big steers in the back of this truck. And I was in junior high school when, you remember, you cannot be different from anybody else. You just cannot be different. And I started talking maybe about 4 miles before we got to the school. Daddy, I think I'll just walk. Can you just drop me off somewhere? You know, I never walked anywhere. I think I walked. And Daddy, well, we got closer and closer and closer, and we drove up in front of what was then Buchholz Junior High School back in the 50s. And 1,000 kids came flying out the front door. Oh, look at the cow! And the minute the truck stopped and I got out, both cows, poor babies, the steers, exploded all over the defecating in horror all over. And the kids were, wow, look at that! They just made their day. And I had to run into I never forgave my father for doing that. I hinted without really having the courage to say, Daddy, please let me off here. I don't want to. I'll walk. And everybody knew what I was doing. Everybody knew. Well.
Nobody tells a story like Mimi. There's always a new fun story. Chuck, I wonder if you could comment a little bit about moving from family life. Of course, we want to add there was a fifth Carr child, David, born last, who co-owns Pearl Country Barbecue with his wife, Peggy. And as the children were all school age, Marjorie's activism was able to grow, beginning with preserving the live oak trees in downtown Micanopy, which also preserved the beautiful 19th century buildings, and then branching out into Paynes Prairie. And I wonder if you could comment a little about first just what it was like that anytime you went into Gainesville, you crossed the prairie back when the I-75 wasn't there yet, right? To your mother working to protect the prairie and turn it into a state park. Just more about the prairie.
Well, I'm not sure I'm the best authority on that subject because I was not present for some of these years when Mother was getting that done. But we had to cross the prairie, as Mimi said, to get to school essentially every day. And my father was mad about the prairie. And so as kids growing up, it was not strange that my mother was saying, this is a beautiful place. We've got to do something to it. And she perceived the threats to it better than I could at the time. But she undertook to make sure that that magnificent expanse of nature was not damaged. And it was under threat even then by Mr. Camp, who turned out to be a pretty nice fellow up in Ocala. But it was the Camp Ranch. That was all cattle. And he maintained a drainage canal on the prairie so that the water drained off ultimately to Orange Lake and whatnot. And that reduced the water table and he could run his cattle. Well, that was a threat to it. Back in Bartram's day, it was more like it is now, more water. And so that kind of land management was threatening to the existence of this ecosystem, and it had to be changed. And the only way you could change anything in that scale is have the state or the federal government procure it, take it out of the private hands. And eventually, a friendly arrangement was made. The camps were happy to turn it over. Daddy would call Mr. Camp at will, because he took graduate students from here at the university on field trips out to Paynes Prairie. And he'd drag up water hyacinths and see what kind of little organisms were living in the roots of the hyacinths. It's a great microhabitat. But before he did that, he called Mr. Camp and say, I want to do it. Is that going to be all right with you? And they'd say, yes, sir, go right ahead. So that was, we kind of comprehended fully. This wasn't a strange thing that Mother was up to, that it needed to be done. And then Daddy wrote about it in a couple of his books, and he loved the prairie. And one marvelous thing, and maybe you know it better than I do, but he and Mother are crossing the prairie in an early morning setting. Do you remember this one, Amy? Yeah. And there's a bull out there grazing, Brahma, with gray horns. And spider webs were strung between the tips of the horns. And dewdrops were on the spider webs. And he said, he's pounding on Mother and said, blah, blah, blah. They get all excited. They're driving this car, this fantastic scene you have of a lyre. And that was true. He loved it. They both did. And so it was quite natural that when she was moving around like that became a project of hers.
If I could add, the Garden Club was also very involved with this project. Mother was not alone. You know, really, it's interesting that Mother was never alone in any of her projects. There were wonderful people in all of them. One of them is the lady sitting in the front row in the interesting sweater. Marvelous people who were environmentalists and conservationists, many of them who lived way away from the Ocklawaha River and Paynes Prairie, that really very early on saw that Florida was this unique state. The environment of Florida was unique in all of the continental United States, and that it was in danger. And they were, the beginning of citizens activism, which you all remember was kind of big in the late 60s and 70s. Citizens were interested, let's get up and try to save pieces of our environment. I also want to stress, although I never heard them say it, but just looking back, that somehow Mother and Daddy, the book was published in the 18th century, but somehow I remember Mother ululaing about William Bartram's travels, that somehow they came into contact with that book in the early 50s. And it was not, it's recently been, sort of recently, been rewritten in a non-18th century style. You get. I have trouble reading them when the the S's are like F's and all that. It's sort of difficult to read. But his description of the prairie, and then they learned, as you all probably know, that his description of the Alachua sink and how the water disappeared into the ground, allegedly influenced Samuel Taylor Coleridge in his poem Xanadu. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alf the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man down to the sunless sea. They all believed that, maybe they said Coleridge did drugs, so maybe that was it. But that his description of something of water going underground like that impressed him to write that poem. And if any of you will ever have a chance to read some of it, he waxes eloquent about deer running on the prairie and the Indians and, and alligators being able to walk across, as Mother said, it was like Bartram just got beside himself around here, and it must have been beautiful. It must have been, the Indians knew a thing or two. They were living on the highlands all around the prairie and further south around Tuscaloosa. And that book, I think, had a lot of impact on Mother and Daddy. I think more scholars probably knew about it long before Mother and Daddy did. But that's a memory I have of the early 50s of Mother talking about the book. But not to forget, just to reiterate, that it was the Garden Club, and I am so sorry I cannot remember the other three ladies that Mother worked with on that project to try to recognize the prairie, to put a sign up about it, and the palm trees, that it wasn't just to recognize what this treasure was that we have just south of our town.
In speaking of Paynes Prairie and the Gainesville Garden Club women and others, including Preacher Gordon, who was involved in the efforts to turn Paynes Prairie into a preserve and state park. At the same time that was going on, that was about a decade of work to make that come about. There was a campaign to save Lake Alice from being drained for the construction of a two-lane cross-campus throughway, 4 lanes total, in a 2,000-car parking lot. I wonder if either of you has any memories of your parents talking about the importance of Lake Alice. Certainly your father's research, it was important for that reason, but the idea of losing Lake Alice and what they did to save it.
No, I don't really. I'm sorry, that was, again, I was not here. Chuck, can you add they didn't talk about it that I remember. I'm sorry, I can't really. Do you remember, Chuck? Yeah, yeah.
But all I remember is the outrage of my parents and their associates, especially in the biology department. It was madness, and it was coming out of Jacksonville. Was that?
You're right. It was a parking lot. The drain. Yeah, I just remember that Daddy going to see the president of the university, right. Steve O'Connell, about it. That it was, the university is always looking for more parking places. And I think that was one of their plans. And, it was, again, thank God, and it wasn't just Mother and Daddy. It was a lot of people at the university saying, do you know what a treasure it is we have in our university? And by God, of course it is. They've built the Baum Center. There is the bat aviary there. And you go there and you see the number of students that go down there to just sit. And looking back on your student days, wouldn't it have been nice to have a lake to go and sit by, even to have an alligator floating around in it, something to get away from school, to, just to calm down or get over your depression about being in school. And you see that on the prairie to this day, the number of people that go out there to watch the sunset at the prairie, There used to be a guy that would go out and he'd bring his drum set and the back of his pickup truck, and he'd drumming as the sun sets over the Paynes Prairie.
Thank you, Chuck. What you were bringing up is the proposed Tampa to Jacksonville Turnpike that in the late 1980s, your mother, working with Florida Defenders of the Environment and other nature organizations across the state, stopped. Now, this has reared its ugly head again, right? A few years ago, there was a really good marketing person. It became I-75 Relief. Then it became the Coastal Connector, and now is it the Coast to Coast? It's just come back this week. But in the case in the late 1980s, Attorney General Bob Butterworth responded to your mother and other activists, pointing out that these road projects were designed simply to raise money and open environmentally sensitive lands to development, and arguing that your mother said it wasn't that no road was needed to get from here to there, but that you didn't need 3 roads to get from here to there and to maybe get there 30 minutes faster. But let's move back in time a bit. Chuck, you mentioned in your bio your unusual early years in Honduras. And I know both of you have some wonderful memories. But Chuck, could you talk a little about the scientific importance of tortuguero? You hinted at it again, but could you explain what that was and what this meant for not just Florida, but the world in terms of sea turtle conservation?
Well, that's a tall order there, because his daddy's biographer called him the man who saved sea turtle. That was the second title of the book. That came about, the global movement can largely be associated with his popular books, beginning with The Windward Road, but then several others subsequently, in which, and Daddy really could write. He was a master of the English prose. And so he could tell these stories of the anguish, of the risk of the turtles, the interest of the turtles, the beauty, and people around the world picked up on it. And he became, of course, then the first chairman of the Sea Turtle Specialist Group of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. This is way, way back. And so he was able there to rally other biologists from all around the world, and they got this momentum going. And now the number of people that turn up at the annual sea turtle conventions is like 2,000 or 3,000 from all over the planet every year. And so it's really truly a global movement. Meanwhile, he's publishing data on the green turtles especially, because that's what we mostly have down at Tortuguero. People here at the University at Central Florida started working on the loggerheads down at near Melbourne. And that's now the Archie Carr National Wildlife Refuge, and has just an enormous population of nesting loggerheads and now green turtles. In the past few decades, green turtle population has just boomed down there, and it's really exciting all the biologists. And so on, all around the world. Australia started working on their turtles, and people all over the place. So I associate the global movement, especially with his popular writing. Do you think that's about right?
You know, on a sort of slightly depressing note, I remember Daddy, toward the end of his life, was writing a lot about how the leatherback turtles, the giant, the largest of all the sea turtles, as you probably know, they live on jellyfish. And they were discovering, and Daddy died in 1987, that the leatherbacks were starting to ingest plastic bags, and I don't know what he would think now as we read more and more about sea animals, whales and sea turtles and all ingesting all the plastic that we are creating in the world. And it is good that countries are beginning to ban plastic bags, but it's one of the things facing us that we've got to cope with. There was a long article, I think, in the New York Times about the young man that has wanted to go to the Gyre, which is somewhere in the Pacific where tons of plastic, you all have read about that probably, and tons of it, how to scrape it up. And there's some people saying, oh, to hell with that, there's the microplastic, that's what you've got to worry about. But I think it would be wonderful if we could find a way to harvest all that plastic out of the ocean, and it's like thousands of metric tons, and find some way to recycle it. I mean, we went to the moon, why can't we do that? But it's, I think Daddy would be horrified.
Well, you're right, that was depressing. And we didn't get the fun memories of Honduras. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit in terms of, these are some of your earliest memories of your mother in particular, but growing up and being the translator for your mother as well. Could you just tell us a little about your time growing up in Honduras?
I remember so much about Honduras, and I think it's real memories, not things that were told to me. I was 2 when we went there, and Chuck was about 6 weeks old. God, Mother, and her friend Lucy Dickinson, going, in a DC-3. The war was still on in Asia when we went in 1945. But it was, as I've told Peggy, one of my memories of Mother, and Mother and Daddy were collectors. They were naturalists. There was of that period when I'm afraid a lot of animals lost their lives because a lot of birds. Mother was making specimen skins of birds of that part of Honduras, the highlands of Honduras. And these specimens, this is what people did then, now they photograph it. But in those days, you had to kill them, and then you had to take out their innards and stuff them, to make a bird specimen, like in a museum. And Mother had a little grant from the Museum of Comparative Zoology in Boston, and also the Florida State Museum, to make these collections. And one of my earliest memories is of my mother, her brown hands, as I told Peggy, and she had this little set of really nice German dissecting tools, that of course I was fascinated by, but she wouldn't, like tweezers and forceps and little scalpels and probes. And it was in a little red leather thing. And Mother, I remember her daintily, removing the little belly sack out of some kind of a flycatcher, little tiny cut, and taking that out, and various other of the viscera of the little bird, and then stuffing it with cotton and stitching it up. And I remember her brown hands doing this work. It's a strange thing to remember your mother doing. But they, apparently her collection made quite an impression. And she published a little book about it that was really interesting to read about the birds and migration. She was, ornithology was her main field of interest. And they had a wonderful life. I mean, they had horses that they would ride with various of the students from the school. They'd go after classes. Usually the classes were all in the morning and the early afternoon. And then in the middle of the afternoon, the horses would be brought up, and Mother and Daddy and this group of people would go off into the into the monte to explore and to collect and to and I remember when I lived in Oregon, Mother and Daddy, I lived in eastern Oregon, down close to the California border, And Mother and Daddy said it reminded them so much of Honduras. They did a lot of collecting, but that was then. This is, people don't do any of that now. And I'm frankly kind of horrified about it, but that is what people did then, of collecting animals and putting them in museums.
That was the age of taxonomy, as you're probably aware. And Daddy did it, his first book, The Handbook of Turtles, was all about taxonomy of turtles of North America. Which one is which species is what is its range? And this was a big deal in American science throughout those decades, in the 30s and 40s. And yeah, for a lot of them, you had to shoot them. And Mother was an expert with a 20-gauge shotgun. And one little point I wanted to make might interest you as a group. Mother's skins are still over there at the museum. We had some over at her museum not too long ago. And that makes an interesting thing to go and see. Marjorie Carr's beautifully maintained bird skins from Honduras. Yeah, they're old, but the museum knows what they're doing in terms of taking care of them.
Also, in terms of those collections, they serve an important purpose today. The eggs in the collections of the Florida Museum of Natural History were used to prove that there was a connection between use of DDT and harming the bald eagles' reproduction. And then today, most of that research, that exciting research that's going on, is actually through the computer connecting these existing collections around the world. So they serve a purpose today. But your father felt guilty. He said in one interview that he went back and forth between pining about the fate of the turtle and drooling over them and wanting to eat them. I'd like to talk a little bit, if you would talk a little bit about your parents as well. Mimi, you shared love letters that your parents saved from their early courtship from 1936 and the first roughly half year of their marriage, when they were desperately in love and eloped to the Everglades. And I wonder if you could talk a little about that passion, not just for science, but that deep love that they shared.
Yeah, those letters were, to read love letters of your parents is really quite something. And yeah, but, I think basically they got married in 1937, and Mother was working down in Collier County. She was working for something called the Bass Biological Lab that was run by this eccentric man named Bass. And what they did was they made specimens for comparative anatomy classes. I don't know if you remember any of those who took comparative anatomy, where you had a cat or a dogfish or various frogs that you were supposed to dissect in your class. I'm sure there are many of you sitting in this room that took that class. And they had to create these specimens, not the cats, but things like the dogfish and the sea urchins. I remember when Mother went to visit me in Oregon, and we went out to a tidal pool, and Mother just went off on this memory lane about how difficult it was when you have a sea urchin. And she was basically embalming these animals, I think, is what they were doing, injecting them with formalin. You have to wait till the urchin is just there, and you put the injection in a... Mother, what are you talking about? But, it was the way this guy made money, and it gave my mother a job, that she did that and fed snakes. Oh, God, what a life. That was her job. She fed snakes, and she worked in this, now I've lost the train of thought. What was it again? Love. Well, yeah, love. But anyhow, Mother couldn't quit her job. They needed money. Daddy had no pennies to rub together. He was a graduate student, and his father was a Presbyterian minister. There was very little money. And, as a little side note, Daddy was, again, like Mother was at Willaca at the Ocklawaha with her job through the WPA. Daddy would never have gone to graduate school, he said, if it hadn't been for the beginning of giving young men mostly assistantships to go to school, where you either did technical work in a lab or you taught some beginning biology classes. You know, that was starting to happen when Daddy graduated from the University of Florida in 1934. And it just wouldn't have happened. Yeah, 36. It wouldn't have happened for him. But Daddy had these little jobs like making lantern slides and things like that. They just had no money. So they got married and then decided to do this, not bi-coastal, but by length of the thing, marriage. So they were separated for several months of their marriage. And that's what created this, pile of letters between them. And one of the things that is so funny is that realizing, and maybe I've inherited some of this, is what a drama queen my father was. God, he's like, oh, you shouldn't have married me. I'm nothing. I'm just absolutely nothing. It's not going to, really, he was like, good God, Daddy. And here his mother, this 22, 23, Archie, I am a woman now. I love you. Why are you acting like this? You are a fine person. It was just back and forth, this comforting. But it was very sweet and funny, just their back and forth. That's how they did it. They didn't phone. They didn't have Daddy said, well, I can come visit you next week if I don't eat. And I don't think a lot of us really, we didn't grow up, we weren't young adults during the end of the Depression, and I don't think we realized how poor people were and how tough it was. And yet people really didn't have enough to eat, it was a struggle. It was a struggle to live. But these letters, and one of the cutest ones was actually about their wedding, that Mother and Daddy decided to go off somewhere close to the Everglades. They were visiting her mother, our grandmother, Clara Harris. And Grandma said to them, oh, it was a beautiful night. She said, oh, Marjorie, you must be careful on a night like this. It is too beautiful. You might lose control. I just love her that oh, Marjorie, on a beautiful night like this. She had this Boston accent. And Mother, well, anyhow, by that point, they'd already gone off and gotten married and had come back and saw night herons flying in the way. And when they came back to Grandma's house, Mother slept in her room and Daddy slept in another guest room on their wedding night. But again, people could do stuff like that. I mean, the next day they had a little honeymoon going back up. But that image of grandmother, and she had a kind of a dramatic voice. Oh, Marjorie, and I'm not exaggerating. It's too beautiful a night. You might lose control.
Oh, God, you could definitely see the theater background. Now, I have heard from Joe Little, who is still the vice president of Florida Defenders of the Environment and was an early activist in efforts to save Legacies as well, that listening to Mimi Carr is like listening to her mother. And I have to say, I think this is the first time, maybe it's the white shirt or your haircut, but you look like your mother today. We really are channeling the Carrs. In our last questions, I wonder if, now Chuck, you talked earlier about, in your bio, about being at Gainesville High School when your mother was really getting engrossed in efforts to save the Ocklawaha River. Could you talk about your memories?
Well, it was an exciting time. I was quite young, but what the Army Corps of Engineers was about to do was a nightmare. And it was supported by the Canal Authority out of Jacksonville. And so Mother would come home with these reports of these huge personalities, and politicians in Jacksonville, these colonels in the Army with big, beautiful uniforms on. and what they proposed to do, to dig this ditch, destroy that river, but then potentially pollute the Florida aquifer with a 12-foot deep canal, which later turned out to not have an economic basis to begin with. So it was all, I presume, maybe you know better than I do, Peggy, the greatest motivation was to dig the ditch, not to make any money off of running products across the canal, because that was not going to happen. It's a 12-foot deep canal. And late in the project, I think FDE got a hold of some real barge people in the Mississippi River area. And they're bringing grain and products down from the Midwest. And the idea was, all right, just bring it across the Gulf, and now we can cross to the Atlantic through the Cross-Florida Barge Canal. And these guys said, well, these barges of ours are bigger than this room. We can't fit in your canal. Oh, well, then we'll build a transloader or something out near Tampa, and that drives the cost of the product about 5 times up. You know, you unload the big barge and put it in the little barge. And when that came out in the press, it was just about over, the whole concept. And meanwhile, the environmental potential impacts were becoming clear to the public at large, thanks to FDE and Mother's ability, and you know this story, she recruited people from the University of Florida and other experts around the state. And people couldn't resist her. Mother would not let them off the phone until they said, well, I'll do.
The telephone.
And so she got real scientific experts to join her and evaluate every aspect of that canal construction. And incidentally, that they produced the first environmental impact statement in the history of the country. That is a major historical point, which I sort of like to stress, Peggy. What they were doing with the canal was before the Endangered Species Act, before the National Environmental Policy Act. It was early in American environmental movement. So you talk about Daddy starting. I think FDE and Mother started this whole whole outlook on environmentalism and activism and what you can do, but by maintaining a scientific focus. That was, I think, her greatest contribution. Don't just wave placards and everything. Get some data and show it to the colonels, show it to the politicians. Here is what happens if you dig that hole in the ground, and so on, like that.
Maybe before I turn to you, if Jack Davis were here, he'd point out it was actually the Everglades Jetport was the very first environmental impact statement, but it was a model for this one, and the FDE environmental impact statement was so thorough because your mother recruited people, experts from hydrology, economics, the law, historians, to really paint a portrait of the Ocklawaha and the wildlife long before white settlers came to Florida, and then the impact. And it proved beyond a doubt that, as you were pointing out, that the economic basis for the canal just didn't exist because it was based on inflated environmental benefits, recreational benefits. The core literature included a drawing of a white family in their bikinis, and they're waving as the barges go by as they enjoy the water. But Mimi, I'd like to turn to you because you were at a seminal hearing related to the barge canal, or a pseudo hearing. Could you talk a little about what that hearing was like in Tallahassee, the alleged hearing?
Yeah, it's just how an event of arrogance and kind of stupidity helped to galvanize a lot of people about the Cross-Florida Barge Canal. They finally, after great effort, well, first of all, I want to start. The thing that galvanized people here in Alachua County, and it was mostly Alachua Audubon, they were talking about a canal in about 1961 or 62, and they had a hearing somewhere around here. And some functionary from the government, I think from the Department of Interior, was sent down, and all they had to show about this canal was a framed picture, painting of what the canal would look like. You know, they had no specs, nothing else. It was just this fantasy of what the canal would look like. And people went there thinking, well, maybe there is reason for a canal, and gradually realizing how badly thought out this is, it started getting people really exercised about it. And then gradually, when they realized at the beginning that it was going to destroy this river, and then gradually, as Chuck mentioned, what hell it was going to create, like the very least saltwater intrusion into our drinking water by digging this ditch across this karst topography. But then, so there were the beginnings. And then in around 1965, by dint of enormous effort, FDE, which had been formed at this point, got a large group of people to go. They were going to have a hearing in Tallahassee, and it was going to be chaired by Tom Adams, the Secretary of State. And people came from Miami, came from South Florida, all around South Florida, at their own expense to drive to Tallahassee for this hearing. Some of the people were still working, they weren't all retired. They were very vigorous working people. But when they arrived, Adams had fixed it, that the people that were interested in speaking about the danger of this canal, all of those people were made to sit in the what do you call it, where the visitors gallery. It was held in the House of Representatives at the State House. And he loaded it up. And I remember seeing them. They looked like they went to various bars in, St. Mark's or Panacea, and swept up a bunch of old fogies and had them sit in these chairs, these sort of old people just sitting there. They didn't know what they, really. I mean, it was like something out of a movie. And these other people, the people who had come up there to speak. And then Tom Adams proceeded to sneer I remember one of the worst ones that he sort of attacked was, what was she was, she was from, her daughter was the park ranger that saved Peg, well, anyhow, this woman that was quite a good chemist and knew what she was talking about. And he started this really rude cross-questioning of this woman, Mrs. Morrison, Helen Morrison. You remember she was looked absolutely beautiful wearing a shark skin dress. I mean, she just got up, and Tom Adams just went after her. But the person that kind of came across really good was David Anthony, who was a chemistry professor here at the university. And he did most of the speaking, and he was very flippant with everybody, which enraged Tom Adams. But I saw that as really galvanizing a lot of people that, we're not going to get anywhere with these. We've got to find another way to fight this, because it was insulting what he did. It was insulting.
That was awesome. Moving forward, of course, the canal was deauthorized. So the problem was that in 1942, there was an authorization to build the canal, but no money. 20 years later, you have the authorization continuing, and the funding comes through. And your mother heard from a fellow member of the Florida Federation of Garden Clubs, who was in Jacksonville. That's where she first heard about the canal starting. But through the Herculean efforts of the Florida Defenders of the Environment, Lachua Audubon, and this class on the Ocklawaha has learned about that. Ultimately, you have, after the authorization, Marjorie winding down, right? She's, 1987, your father dies, 1997, she's on her deathbed, remaining optimistic about the future of the river. And here we are in 2019. I'd like to hear from both of you on what your take is in terms of what your mother would think today.
Well, number one, she'd be disappointed with the current status quo. And frankly, there are people who know better about it than I do, but it's mystifying to me. And I guess I'm not close enough to it. Maybe FB can speak to it more in terms of who is not doing what. We work a lot with U.S. Forest Service, and they have a lot of control over the Rodman Pool, and they're not draining the pool down. So, and Tallahassee, the head politicians up there get close, but then back away. And I believe that what's holding it up is a sport fishing lobby. There's no real other reason to keep that water there, because for outdoor recreation, all the people in Palatka itself say, no, put the river back and you'll have some real outdoor recreation. Have a beautiful river to cruise up and down on, and good fishing as well, because the original Ocklawaha River produced a lot of good black bass and striped bass too, seasonally, not to mention catfish galore. So I'm sure Mother would be unhappy, and I can't give a clearer report on who is not doing what. Maybe you know, Peggy, but why is it sitting out there? And you're all going to go out and see it. It's a startling thing. It's a huge impact, that silly dam and this vast expanse of water. And then you see all the tree stumps sticking up. There's 1,000 acres of swamp forest that were obliterated for what? You know? Can you augment on that?
I don't want to sound like a negative, because, you have to be positive to be interested in the environment. And I think Mother would be very disappointed, but I think she would still be working the phones. She was like, I would think like Lyndon Johnson was, the masters of the telephone and making people do things they didn't want to do, calling busy men and getting them to do things they didn't want to do. But I just wonder if it is, in a strange way, is a symbol that we're not going to let the environment, I'm sorry to be negative like this, we're not going to let the environmentalists get this. We're not going to let them win, because it's such, as Chuck has pointed out, sort of a ridiculous. It isn't, you can't go speeding around 70 miles an hour in your bass boat. You'll rip the bottom out of it. And they used to say, and I heard this with my own ears, it's because George Kirkpatrick wants his own fishing hole. I don't know if that was true, but that's what they said, Wyatt, back in the 80s when it was being defeated. I don't know. I hope I'm wrong. I hope there's some other reason that it isn't just revenge. Sorry.
Well, you're so dramatic. You are, just like your father.
Probably not the way to look at things, and maybe I'm depressed, but I hope it's not true. You've got to be more positive. You've got to keep up, and they have wonderful people over there in Palatka that are doing a lot of work to save it. But it just keeps on going, They have to drain it. They have to drain it because it gets filled up with hydrilla and everything, right? I mean, and it costs $1 million or more each year. They have to do that.
Right. So you'll hear more when you go out and visit. But Karen Chadwick is somebody who has spent her life on the river and who regularly posts photos on Facebook of herbicides that are used because the drawdowns at Rodman every 3 to 5 years are not enough to keep this artificial water body healthy. But the dam, right, the George Kirkpatrick or Rodman Dam is really the only dam like it that serves no purpose. It's defunct, right? It's part of the pool serves no purpose. It would have provided water for the Cross Florida Barge Canal, which was not completed. So there's no hydroelectricity. There's nothing that comes from it. And now we have a governor who seems to be interested in water issues. Previously, Governor Scott was the only governor since Reuben Askew who did not approve of restoring the river. Every other governor has supported it. So we'll see what happens. But I think it's a good time to open the floor to questions.
First of all, a round of applause, please, for the panel. I want to make one comment. You said about Marjorie on the telephone, but I remember at her memorial service here in town that I think it was Buddy McKay told the story of her going to Washington, and she wanted to see Buddy about the canal, and he was really busy or something, and she sat down, and he said the receptionist called and told him, Mrs. Carr is out here, and she says she is not leaving if she has to stay here every day for a month. So Buddy, of course, saw her. Are there any questions?
First of all, I feel privileged to have heard this story from you folks who've lived it. In the best case scenario, thinking of the practicality, what can be done to restore as much of the nature as possible if there was a will to do it?
To restore nature? At what scale are you talking about? Globally? Or?
Destruction that has occurred because of the aborted canal.
Oh, because of the canal. One thing that I'd like to fall back on is nature can heal itself pretty doggone well. So if we could get down the dam, let that water vanish, all of those forests there replenish themselves all the time. There's seeds coming down the Ocklawaha River now. There are a lot of maple trees and gum trees and cypress. Those things, that swamp forest would come back within 20, 25 years. You'd start seeing things. So that's one thing to cling to when you ask that question. There's some engineering might be required, but the Army Corps of Engineers itself knows how to handle that kind of thing. Put the place back together physically. Whether they move dirt, you can do, but that's pretty simple. Get some bulldozers and drag lines. But the hard part is what Mother Nature is going to do, and I'm quite certain it would do it. And you're certain if you go out there in a boat and look around in the spring, you'll see little seedlings here and there in the aquatic environment. And that gives you an indication that it can restore itself. If they've damaged the aquifer, that's a very serious thing. If water has gotten down into the Florida aquifer and it's polluted, it takes a long time to unpollute. Water has to sort of drain out, or people down in Orlando have to drink it up or something. So does that help?
I can say that next week, as I said, you will hear the legal issues and some of why we still have the dam. But the following week, there is, Margaret Spontak will give a presentation on potential plans for restoration and calling it the Ocklawaha Blue Way. And you will get a lot more answers then about that. So
just thank you all for coming. In one of Archie's works, he discusses the problem of snakes trying to cross the highway and remarks how many thousands of snakes and other creatures were killed and that there was no natural causeway for these creatures to go elsewhere. Do either of you recall any of that work?
he's talking about crossing the prairie on 441 and 301.
441. As a matter of fact, I joined a committee that helped put up that eco passage. They put walls along 441 and big underpasses. Some of them are the old cattle underpasses, but they stored some others. And that basically has terminated the snake slaughter. But it could get, I think, we even had Florida Highway Patrol supporting our position because it became dangerous out there. We get leopard frogs by the tens of thousands not to mention snakes, and big, beautiful snakes. And that was probably following a weather event. They all jump up and cross and they get mashed by the thousands. And that little bit of engineering, that eco passage, you can see the wall. It's got a little lip on it on both sides. It worked. It really worked. And they've got photographs in the underpasses of bobcats, white-tailed deer, gators, and everything else in the fauna going through those underpasses. So that worked.
And it works well, except when the prairie's really high and those passages, some of the animals like the deer can't find there, but still keeps them from jumping across. So you don't see, I remember some of that roadkill. Are there any other questions? Okay, I would just like to add a little personal note here. It kind of to show how you never know what's connected to what or who to who or who to whom, I suppose. I was on the board of FDE, and I remember meeting out at Paynes Prairie on a picnic pavilion one time discussing what needed to be done. But through the years, and you've heard this mentioned last week, the Marjorie Carr Greenway. Well, we have with us today a person who worked for the St. Johns River Water Management District, Ms. Latane Donnellan, whose husband was the PI on the project, and David's wife, Peggy Carr, was instrumental in getting a grant early in the 90s to get that greenway done. So, and then he mentioned the Archie Carr Preserve. Well, Walt Disney World owned 3 major parcels in Brevard County that are, and Fred and I both worked for the company, and we did the environmental assessments on those 3 pieces of property and turned them into Brevard County. A couple of the coastal pieces became county parks, but eventually all 3 of those parcels now, the major, particularly the ocean, well, are part of the Archie Carr National Wildlife Refuge. So you never know, all these little dots connect from time to time. Please, if there are no more questions, remember next week with Mr. Castor, and then the following week with Margaret Spontak. For those of you on the trip tomorrow morning, we will see you bright and early, all bundled up. And thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.